Right then, if we are now formally off, it's great to be back, so to speak, for the opening meeting of this season of the North Staffs branch of the Classical Association. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Alison Sharrock, who, as you can see from a worn appearance, has known me for a very long time. Alison, of course, before moving to Manchester, used to work here. And this is a little bit, I hope, like happy memories, if say that. And this evening, she's going to talk to us about Ovid the Proto-Feminist, ? And I shall leave the floor with Alison.
Thank you very much, Andy. Yes, it is a great pleasure to be here. It's the first in-person, apart from ordinary teaching, talk I've done since the pandemic. And to come back to Keele, I left Keele in 2000 when my children were well, my youngest was 5 when we left, and has really no memory of Keele at all. But I just sent them a picture of Keele Hall and said, can you tell where this is? And the middle one said, Keele University, I presume, because they knew I was coming out. I thought that was not very profound, but they were all, you know, had their young childhood here. So it's quite amusing. I knew my office was just up in this building, of course, just a bit further up. Yes, that way. Yeah, my sense of direction is not very good. But yeah, so it's lovely to be here, and I want to congratulate the North Staffs branch of the Classical Association on not only on sort of on maintaining its existence through, you know, without a classics department in the university. I think that's, you know, very much down to Stephen and Chris, and I suppose Andy helps out as well. It's lovely to be here. Now, so I was going to talk to you a little bit about Ovid and the question of proto-feminist. Is it, well, or is he actually a misogynist? And in fact, that question is often asked about Ovid. Latin poet, of course, died in around about AD 17. So we had his bi-millennium not very long ago. And it's also asked, the same question is asked about Euripides, the Greek tragedian, you know, where regarded by some people as a terrible misogynist and by other people as a proto-feminist. I mean, that's a slightly anachronistic way to describe it. But the other way, this is more going back to Ovid now. It's a question that I have asked students very often, and indeed I was asked when I was a student, something along the lines of, Ovid is often regarded as sympathetic to women. Is this true? What do we mean by it? I mean, that was even asked, you know, in the 80s when I was a student, and it's usually the favourite question for students to address as to what we might mean by it. But alongside that, I don't know how much people know about the poetry of Ovid here. Do we know much about the poetry of Ovid? I'll tell you a little bit, shall I? Just to sort of,
why not?
Yeah. So we've got the amatory poetry, Love Elegy, which is, of course, as the name would suggest, a series of love poems, but very much in an existing tradition of love poetry that has sort of defined how you do love poetry. And he is coming towards the end of that tradition and kind of plays with it. And I'm going to look at a few of those poems in a moment. And some of them are quite problematic, actually. And then there's his great work, The Metamorphoses. And many of the things, I was talking to a student just recently about Greek myth and the fact that so much of what we think of, Greek things you think of as a Greek myth, quite often the way we know those are actually through Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is a Latin poem, which is the great mediator of Greek myth to the Western tradition, and so massively influential on art and so on through Middle Ages, Renaissance, and into the modern world. So lots and lots of stories of myths, all with something to do with things turning into other things in some way, sometimes rather obscurely to do with that. And one of the sort of aspects of the Metamorphoses is that although in some sense it's an epic poem, and it's always got one eye on Virgil's Aeneid, which came just before it, in other ways it presents itself as an epic poem that is as different as you could possibly be from Virgil's Aeneid and still be an epic poem. And if you look at the word, I mean, if I had if we were in a classroom, I'd write the word out, but if you just look at the word metamorphoses, now the actual real proper meaning of this Greek word is meta and morph as in shape and the changes of shape. But there is a bilingual pun going on in it as well, because if you think of it, if you just envisage the letters, met, amor, phoses, right? It's got amor, the Latin word for love, in the middle of it. And, most scholars nowadays are convinced that this is exactly a play that Ovid is doing, and that kind of bilingual pun is the kind of thing that he would love. Because this is a poem dominated by love stories, in a sense. Yes, love stories, most of which are actually more what my students would say, well, it's lust really, not love. And that many of them are stories of gods either succeeding in or failing to rape human women, and thus often causing the origins of towns and producing the great heroes and so on. Okay, this means that an awful lot of the poem has got stories of actual or attempted rape. As a result of this, in recent years, I remember talking to an American colleague not very long ago, I mean, that's probably about 3 or 4 years ago now, saying that the Metamorphoses is becoming almost impossible to teach in America. I think it's actually improved a bit since then, possibly anyway. I think it's certainly improved in Britain because of the subject matter, because it's got so much rape in it, you're sort of expected to do trigger warnings and so on because of the nature of this text. Now, I thought one of the things I would like to do with you is talk a little bit about how I manage that process, how I address the problem of there being a lot of rape, quite a lot of failed rape as well, attempted sexual assault in the poem, and whether this is a misogynistic act on the part of the poem, shall we say, or whether it might in fact be, and this is what I actually argue, is that it's actually a very sort of sympathetic representation, because a lot of these are actually focalized. That is, you enter into the experience of the woman, and they are actually very sympathetic. On the one hand, they give a lot of voice, and I hope we'll have time, though, to explore one of the lesser known stories. So there's quite a few stories I'd like to explore with you. One of the lesser known stories about that expression of the suffering caused by rape. On the other hand, however, it is also true that the poem and all the poems of Ovid, and I haven't actually told you quite about all of them, but do enter into the kind of aestheticization and objectification of the female body. And so, you know, there is a sort of voyeuristic, slightly sort of titillating presentation of the female body in these poems as well. So, you know, there is that possibility that one might need to see it as problematic. I think how you deal with that is just acknowledging that it's problematic. The ancient world is full of problematic things, like slavery and you know, and horrendous physical kind of punishments and so on, and inequality and all the rest of all these things. So, you know, and a very unequal treatment of women. So let's not pretend that's not true. But how do we deal with this? One of the ways that people deal with the rather more uncomfortable aspects of reading a poet like Ovid is to say literature and life have nothing to do with each other, that they're separate areas, and this is literature, not life. Now, that is an idea that Ovid himself tried to run. And that first thing on the handout, which I call deny all responsibility, is an example of that. He says, believe me, my behavior is quite different from my poetry. My life is modest. It's my muse that's playful. Large part of my work is deceitful and fictitious. It permits more to itself than its author. So he's saying, nothing to see here. There's no bad behavior. It's only just poetry. It's all fiction. The trouble with that is the context of when he's speaking. This is in one of his works from exile, because he was sent into exile by the Emperor Augustus, because he says of a song and a mistake. And he won't tell us what the mistake is, but the song is his Ars Amatoria, his The Art of Love. And he is writing this poem to Augustus to say, you shouldn't have sent me into exile. It was only a poem. What were you doing sending me into exile for a poem? We all know poems have got nothing to do with life, don't we? That's a bit of a problem when you've just been sent into exile for writing a poem, because that kind of does suggest that it might have something to do with life. So we've got a bit of a problem. Does poetry have anything to do with life? Well, now, another way that modern modern writers, modern scholars deal with this, it's a different version of this, poetry's got nothing to do with life. And it's a little bit more subtle, but it's a bit problematic, though it's also, I think, true, which is persona theory. Persona theory, I don't know if you've come across this, it's the idea that the poet as you see him in the poetry, so the speaker in the poetry, is a persona and is different from the flesh and blood poet. Now, I actually think that is absolutely right, that is true. The trouble is, it can also be a kind of get out of jail free card. It can be a way of sort of saying anything we don't like in the poetry, we can just say, oh, well, that's just the persona. And the actual poet is, after all, just like us, because, you know, Ovid is actually, my mate and thinks the same as me about everything. And funny that, isn't it? Because that's how we construct poets in our own image. And we do that all over the place. We all do that. There's some truth in that, but there's also, I think it's probably quite important, I think, that we don't let it blind us to the problems that there really are in the poem. And seeing these problems, acknowledging these problems, does not mean we should not be reading this poetry. There was some people who at some point were saying we shouldn't read it because it's got, I'm going to tell you about poems of domestic abuse in a moment. And there was a line saying we shouldn't be reading this poetry because of that. I don't think it does that at all. I think we should be reading it because for exactly the same reasons. Okay, so I'd like to tell you a little bit about Amoris 1-7. If you'll excuse me just 1 second. Because I have in here got somewhere a bottle of water. Some of these bags have got multiple, it wouldn't be the last one, which I bought on the way down. I couldn't get the lid off. So can you please get the lid off? It's fizzy, by the way. So
that could be dramatic on the Zoom.
it would be, wouldn't it? Yes, yes. Thank you.
No drama here, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. Yes, sorry about that. Yeah. Sorry, that's better. Right. Now, so here we have Amoris 1-7. This is a poem. It's one of the love poems of Ovid, and it's one of the ones that has caused the most sort of distress to readers, because it is basically a story of domestic abuse. Because what happens is that the poet in the Amoris, it's always it's first person. It's the poet. It speaks as the lover, and so there's no kind of surround that makes it a character. It is the poet in a sense. It is Ovid in a sense, and so he's got this poem where he has beaten up his girlfriend, and he is now overcome by remorse. And the poem is him describing her. I mean, the second quotation there at the bottom of the first page is the very opening of it. Put my hands into chains, into bonds. They have deserved chains, and until this madness goes away. Siquis amicus adest. If there is any friend here, that's very odd, but come back to that possibly in a minute. And then he describes the beloved, and that's that first big passage there. And it is actually quite a sort of voyeuristic description of her, with the trembling limbs and the eyesore, this stress on his view of her. But standing there like a statue, like rocks cut from Parian ridges. That means marble. Parian stands for marble, and it means like a statue. And so it's a kind of objectification of the beloved. And he goes on about how, oh, I am so terrible, I'm so awful, I'm so sorry. Come on, you hit me back, and so on. And then right at the end of the poem, just the last line, everyone calls it the sting in the tail at the end of the poem. He says, but just so that no one will know about it, just tidy up your hair. Yeah. And everyone says, oh, it's a sting in the tail. He hasn't really hurt her at all he's done is mess up her hair. Yeah? I mean, you know, it's so modern in a way, this is the kind of the denial of domestic abuse. And it's even kind of cleverer than that, because he that's the very last bit of there. So that there be no signs of my wickedness, tidy up your hair. Now, later in the Ars Amatoria, in his poem about the how to be a good lover, the one he got sent into exile for, he says, he makes a reference back to this poem and says, watch out, don't beat your girlfriend up. I made a mistake doing that. Now, I don't really think I broke her dress, but she says I did, and I had to pay for it. So he creates this kind of bigger picture that tempts you into thinking, actually, oh, maybe he didn't really do anything. maybe he, as if there was a really for it to be. It tempts you to think that there was a really for it to be. Maybe he didn't really do anything. Maybe he just did mess up her hair, as he is saying now. But you know, there could be that could be exactly part of the problem. It's kind of the tendency to sort of blame the victim rather than believe the victim. When, after all, as we see it happening, you know, she is struck with horror, and in fact, he says in the poem, I haven't put this bit in, that he did tear her dress, and it's worryingly eroticized in the description of the tearing of the dress. And he says, oh, ouch, shouldn't have done that. And he says that, oh, the belt stopped the tear going any further. I mean, oh, come on. I mean, you know, it's really quite problematic. So here we've got this poem. We're tempted to say there wasn't really anything going on. There wasn't really anything bad. And yet, when you actually look at it, you know, when you look at it with modern eyes, you look at it with eyes that take domestic violence more seriously. I think we take it more seriously now than we did, you know, even in, say, like my young adulthood, when, you know, quite often it would be believed that there was nothing to see here, really. We can see that it's really quite problematic. And I think I just want very briefly to return to that opening thing about the friend. What's this friend here? He speaks all the way through. The speaker, Ovid, let's call him, speaks all the way through. The girl doesn't get to say anything. In fact, there's a lot of stress on her lack of voice, which will be a very important aspect of the Metamorphoses, incidentally, is the loss of voice. But there's this friend who's here, and the friend does get to speak. This amicus who's here, if there's any friend here, and then, and this is now the top of page 2, who didn't say to me, you madman? Who didn't say, you barbarian? Who is this person? What is this person doing here? How come there's an amicus here watching what's going on and maybe even complaining about it? Well, I would say that what's going on here is that the amicus is actually the reader, and that's why it's you, it's us that are observing this, you know, and she doesn't get to say anything. The reader might want to say madman, but barbarian, because it, you know, might make you feel better as a reader if that's the case. Anyway, these are the kinds of poems. I'm just going to say something very, very briefly about Amoris 2:8, because it's another really quite interesting one where the sort of the brilliance of the poetry, and it is brilliant, and the games it plays with you can, if you're not careful, they can sort of obscure the difficulties that are involved as well. And I have to say, when I first read, I mean, I read Amoris 1:7 for years without feeling, I suppose, being taken in by the sting in the tail, and by saying, no, there was nothing to see here. After all, it turned out to be nothing. It was just messing her hair up. Which is exactly the trick it tries to play on you. Now, I mean, you know, I would probably also want to say that Ovid has deliberately played this trick, and that you're meant to see through it and all the rest of it, you know, and that's where the persona comes in and helps you to be allowed to say that the real Ovid, who after all is me in disguise, because everybody's poet is themselves in disguise, intends you to look to see through that ending, but that's another matter. The other one is this diptych, Amoris 2:7 and 2:8. I've just given you a little bit of Amoris 2:8 there, about Fusca Kipassis. In 2:7, Ovid has been accused by his mistress Corinna of having an affair with her enslaved hairdresser. And he denies it. How can you possibly say that I would do this? Who would do this? It's terrible. No, not completely untrue. And then that's Amoris 2.7, and then we get to Amoris 2.8, and guess what? He's talking to the enslaved hairdresser saying, how on earth did she know? It must have been your fault that she knew. And at the end of this poem, it's really, really nasty. And he says, you watch out. I have protected you, so you've got to let me into your bed again. What are you doing? Why are you trying to deny me? If you keep refusing me, I'll tell Corinna in what places I was with you and how often. I will tell to your mistress how often and in what ways. And that's the end of the poem. That's a really nasty piece of manipulation, bullying of this enslaved hairdresser. Slave, obviously. Now, interestingly, to a modern audience, there's an extra twist to this that it's not really there, I think, so much for the original audience, but it would be very much there for a modern audience, is that Capassis is fusca, which means dark. Now, obviously, the term black as an ethnic marker doesn't really exist in the Roman world, not in the way it exists, and certainly not in the connection with slavery that it exists in the modern world, and with the history of race-based American slavery. But for the modern reader, it's actually remarkable that that word is there, that draws attention to her darkness. Because it almost seems like a gift to the modern reader that Ovid couldn't possibly ever have known about. But I think one of the things that is interesting about this diptych, this doubling of poems, is the various kinds of ways that this love triangle can work. So you've got the mistress, Corinna, and then you've got Capassis and Ovid, and in some ways, Capassis and Ovid are, well, by Ovid manipulating it, are ganging up, are working together against Corinna. In another way, Corinna and Ovid, as masters, it will be enough to have earned pleasure of one of your masters. In another way, Corinna and Ovid, as free people, are ganging up on Capassis as a slave, and that she is vulnerable to each of them. Interestingly, the kind of community that doesn't seem to be available is Capassis and Corinna, who you might think could have ganged up on Ovid as women, and indeed as victims of Ovid's manipulation, but that's not there because of the nature of this kind of poetry, where the poet really holds all the strings, if you can hold strings. Yeah, pulls the strings. That's probably what he's doing. So this is another one where it's very useful for sort of thinking about the kinds of manipulations and abuses that can be going on. But at the same time, it is brilliant. It's a brilliant piece of trickery, really, because the first time you read it, it's so nice to have a first time, to be a first time reader. I mean, I've been reading these poems for such a long time now that I really don't have any of this first time feel to them. If you can imagine being a first time reader of 2.7, and you are, you kind of are taken in by it. And then you get to 2.8 and you discover, oh, right, so he was lying in 2.7 then. Maybe if you know Ovid well, you should think he's always lying, perhaps, but there we are. Anyway, I want to move on now. I presume, do I go on to 1:30? Is that right? Or yeah. Because I would like to have some time with you with the Metamorphoses. Because I'd really like you to see this, the complexities of what we might be dealing with here. I think actually they don't have to be in order. I'd just like to talk a little bit about Dryope on page 4 first. And if we have time, we'll go back to Daphne, because Daphne's, I mean, is lovely and it's a very interesting modern poem that you might like to look at. But I would like to talk a little bit about Dryope, because it's a story that is not famous. I mean, Daphne's very famous. I'm sure people have heard of Daphne turning into a tree and the famous Bernini statue that's always used and so on. She's all over the place. And Daphne's also the first erotic tale of the poem, and so it's programmatic in many ways. Dryope is a much less well-known story, but it's one that I think is rather interesting for what I think is a remarkably not prescient, that's not quite the word, because it's not foreknowing, but aware, conscious representation of the damage done by rape. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the story, because I would be on the surprise side if you knew this story, because it's really not a well-known one. Okay, Dryope. It is narrated by Iole to Alcmene. Alcmene is the mother of Hercules by Jupiter, of course. And this is now after the death of the death and deification of Hercules, and Iole is now married to Hercules' son, and she is pregnant. And Alcmene has just been telling her the long story of how terrible the birth of Hercules was. And you probably do know that story about how two knights had to be put together in order to engender Hercules, because he was such a great hero that Jupiter needed an extra long night in order to engender him. And so he stopped the sun from coming up. And so Alcmene tells this story and tells about how the birth was terrible because Juno wanted to stop Hercules from being born, and so that meant that her parturition was stopped by Juno until eventually it's succeeded by a trick. We won't go into that now. Alcmene's just told this story, and now Iole tells a story about her sister, her half-sister actually, Dryope, who also got turned into a tree. So she fits with the story of Daphne as well. And indeed, Daphne's assailant is of course Apollo, and Apollo is an important character in this story as well. So what's happening is, here we have Iole's telling the story of her sister Dryope, who was the only daughter of her mother. Our father engendered me from another woman. So we've got rather complex families going on here. So they're half sisters from the same father. They have different mothers. One time, Iole and Dryope were walking along together. Now, Dryope had been raped by the god who holds Delphi and Delos. We know that's Apollo. So she's been raped by Apollo, but she is married to Andrymon, despite having been raped by Apollo. And Andrymon is regarded as happy in his wife. And you get this picture of a kind of this woman has been raped. Ovid, unlike other versions of the story, is vague about who sorry, I should have said, she has a baby with her, so she's got a baby, and she's carrying the baby. And Ovid is vague about who the father of the baby is. Other versions of the story, it's clearly Apollo. But in Ovid's version, you think, well, it could be Apollo, but you know, it could be Andrymon, it could be whatever. Andrymon has definitely accepted them, and here we have a functioning family. And it kind of looks, despite this, the baby might be the child of Apollo, and Dryope herself is only the half sister of her sister Iole, but it kind of looks like a family environment is sort of saving her and healing her. And there's lots of reasons to think this in the story. It's quite long, the story, and it looks like there is this healing. And so there they are, they're walking along. Dryope's got the baby, her sister's with her, and indeed her father and her brother, not her brother, sorry, her father and her husband come along later on in the story, and they're a big happy family, except for what happens. Okay, what happens? Dryope picks a flower, but when she does, blood comes from it. Now, of course, you were supposed to remember a bit in Virgil's Aeneid when Aeneas pulled reeds out of the ground and blood came up, because they were the spears that had been put on to the youngest son of Priam. So you made to think about that. Whatever. Okay, it's like a kind of incomplete metamorphosis. So the being has turned into a flower, but when you pull it, it still bleeds. So it's like they're still partly human. It's like an incomplete metamorphosis. We get then a little sort of flashback to tell the story of this Lotus, her name is. She too was a nymph, and guess what? Well, not Apollo guilty this time, but Priapus, who attempted to rape her. She ran away, and she kind of, like Daphne, she kind of got away, kind of didn't, because she was turned into a tree. She was turned into a lotus tree. What exactly, I mean, the botanical things of Ovid can get very complicated. Let's not worry about that now. She is turned into a tree, and it's this tree that that Dryope innocently tries to take a flower for. She's taking the flower to show it to her little son. You know, it's all lovely and beautiful, but it's not, because as she takes it, this blood comes out. And what happens then is that she gets turned into a lotus tree as well. It's as if there's a kind of infection of treification comes from Lotus to Dryope. And so gradually, she is gradually turned into the tree. And you see this, you see the story here. You can see how in this story how sort of gentle and beautiful it is before the horror happens. She was carrying her baby son, who was not yet 1 year old, a sweet burden, was feeding him with abundance of warm milk. Not far from the pool, a water lotus was flowering, imitating Tyrian colours in hope of berries. I don't know if they do that actually, but never mind. From here, Dryope had plucked flowers to offer to her son for his delight. And I was about to do the same, for I was present. I saw bloody drops fall from the flower, and the boughs moving in trembling horror. And then she starts turning into the tree. Now, and so the tree starts taking her over, and there's this moment, which I mean, it's long, this passage, I obviously couldn't put it all out for you. The baby starts to realize, because baby's feeding at the same time, because, you know, I think in lots of pre-modern cultures, perfectly normal for women to be feeding while also walking along with a sling or something like that. And the baby notices that you know, that it's going hard, and the milk's not coming anymore. Anyway, she's turning into a tree. Now, I think that's really unusual about Dryape, is that she's given a great long speech as she is turning into a tree. Most people who, as they're turning, it's very, their voice is cut off really early. You know, there's a lovely one when one woman is turning into a horse, and she starts with speech and it goes into a kind of a whinnying sound, and then eventually it turns into just neighing, and she's lost her voice. But that's within like 1.5 lines or something like this. Whereas Dryape's got this great long speech where she speaks about her child. She calls for her father and her husband to come, and they do, and they're all you know, it's all very loving farewell. I mean, obviously grief, but also very supportive. And you can see that here, that I gave you. Care wale conjunx, farewell, dear husband, and you, my sister, and you, father. So it's this kind of family thing that surrounds her, and as she goes, and she asks them, she put a lot of her speeches about the care of the child, and about how, please, you know, bring him here to play under his mother's boughs, you know, get a nurse for him, bring him here, but bring him up to be very careful of trees. And to, you know, not to break any branches or anything like that, because there might be goddesses hidden in them. So it's this kind of, you know, which is the thing, if you're very careful in Metamorphoses, you never know. Anything might be something else. Yeah, I do kind of wonder, but I think this probably is me, not Ovid, whether when she's warning about the child, that she wants him to be brought up, you know, like not to be a rapist. Because there is a kind of sense in which quite accidentally, quite, of course, completely accidentally and innocently, when she plucks the flower, plucking a flower is it's a notorious metaphor for defloration. And, you know, Catullus marriage hymns, it's all, you know, all over the place, and going back to Greek marriage hymns as well, the idea of, you know, plucking the flower or plucking the fruit or whatever as being, you know, what we would call defloration, using the same metaphor. And although she's doing this completely accidentally, there's a kind of sense in which it's repeating the rape. And I kind of think that, you know, one of the things that Ovid is doing here is showing the way that the wound of rape goes so deep that they don't recover, even though she nearly recovered. She nearly had this happy kind of family, odd family, yes, you know, not a straight ordinary nuclear family, but nonetheless a good environment in which there would have been healing, only it doesn't. Instead, this wound, the wound goes too deep. So this is the kind of thing why I would say, although yes, there's an awful lot in the poem that's about rape, I think also so much of it concentrates on the suffering of the women, the suffering of the victim. And I think that's even true that of the very act of metamorphosis itself, so many of the, I've done quite a bit of work on this, so many of the stories of change that really linger on the process of change are of women, and that really kind of focalize through what it's like to be changed into something. Very few of those are of male characters. And really pretty much the only one's Actaeon, actually, the famous one, you know, torn to pieces by his own stag, by his own dogs, turned into a stag, torn to pieces by his own dogs. Other than that, those that really linger on the moment of transformation are all of women, and are sort of entering into their minds. And so I think we've got perhaps 10 minutes to have a look at Daphne. and where I can show you a very, I think, very nice modern example that I was very glad to find of a modern poet who has responded to the story of Daphne. So if you'd like to go back to sort of pages 2 and 3. Oh gosh, this is a very tight lid. Sorry. Who's responded to the story of Daphne in ways that I think are really interesting, and I have actually sort of published something about this, and I got Carol Musgrave Duke's permission to use the poem. Okay, let's just have Daphne's the context a little bit. You remember that Daphne is running away from Apollo. What has happened actually is that Cupid has shot Apollo with with an arrow of love, and has shot Daphne with a lead arrow of refusal. And so she runs away. Apollo follows her, and she prays to her father, who is a river god, to let her escape, to help her to escape. What he does is he turns her into a tree. It's a funny sort of escape, because she's just been very, very fast, and now she can't move at all because she's held to the ground. And that actually allows Apollo to catch up with her. And then we have this moment, which I've given you there on the handout, where he catches up with her, and this allows him to fondle her, and she can't do anything about it. So in some ways, I often feel that Daphne really doesn't escape at all. You know, so we have she's overtaken by the tree, and the only thing that remains is Nitor, is her brightness, or her shining. So, you know, the one thing that she wanted to get rid of, which was her beauty, is the one thing that survives. Was the only thing that remained in it. I love the way that tree names in Latin are almost all trees are feminine, even though they're second declension. There's some of the very, very few second declension feminine nouns. If you know Latin, you'll know that that's quite surprising. You know, most second declension nouns are masculine, except for the neuter ones, they're different. But they are second declension nouns are feminine nouns, tree names. And arbor as well is also a third declension, but that's also feminine. So it says hanc quoque foibus amat, this one, or her, because in Latin, because hanc is feminine, and it has to be. So Phoebus loved this also. Now, is this the tree, or is this the woman? It's like she's woman and tree at the same time. And because the Latin word is a feminine word, it has to use a feminine form there, that kind of fudges over, is she still a woman or not? But at this point, in fact, we can definitely see her, she cringes, even the wood cringes from his kisses. So that the wood is still sentient, and tries to avoid being kissed. And what he does is he says, oh, well, since you can't be my wife, you will be my tree, and I will have laurel, and hence, you know, laurel wreaths and so on, and laurel being used for celebrations and triumphs. And he goes on about the triumph and Augustus and all the rest of that jazz. Okay, just very briefly then, let's have a little look at this rather clever, I think, and rather interesting poem, modern poem, published in 2019. So what we've got here, it's clearly, I mean, the title, of course, is Daphne After. So it's telling us to think about Daphne. It doesn't say anything, it doesn't actually say anything explicit about it, but except the title. So what we've got here is it's a story of two young girls, two schoolgirls, who obviously learning Latin and also almost sort of seeing themselves as perhaps as writers, perhaps philosophers, you know, rather sort of immature way. But one of them is seduced, raped, abused, whatever it might be, by a man at a bus stop, in the form of, well, in the form of Zeus, leaders Zeus. This is about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th stanza. Swans hiss in her ear, obviously reference there to the rape of Leda by Jupiter in the form of a swan. Obviously, I love that line, in the 2nd stanza, ourselves as stoic teens, thinking Marcus, eh? Now, Marcus Aurelius, of course, that is. I don't know whether there's anything more going on there, but they obviously, you know, perceiving themselves possibly as writers, not as written things. And all that stuff about spring and fertility and flowers and so on. But look at this line, in stanza 3, twigs spill from her dropped text as she flees translation class, the nun's query. So she's bunking off school, presumably, and twigs fall from the, I mean, so it's like a kind of a foretelling of her turning into a tree, because she is obviously Daphne. She is going to turn into the tree. And so what happens? He demanded her name first. Of course, we by the name Daphne, just steps from the bus stop, sunset, shade before ancient dark, blossoms beneath her. So this is presumably, you know, lying on the ground, beneath the shock light of staggered street lamps coming on. Leaders Zeus, his suit and tie, swans hiss in her ear. So that's obviously the rape. She told me only. So this is the two of them, you know. So this is the poet hearing the story. And I think that one of the things I love about this is the way that school classics is intertwined with the story of Daphne, the story of the abuse of this girl. So we've got things like, we learned how the passive voice was magnified. So obviously we're talking about the passive voice in, you know, when you're learning the language, you've got to learn how to do the passive. And yet we're also talking about the way that the passive is to suffer female things, you know, to be the passive partner, to be the victim of sexual attack. And so on, various bits. I wouldn't talk about all of it, but Latin offhand, to seize or abduct. Now, of course, you're meant to supply the verb rapio, rapere, from which we get rape. And then we've got this very odd thing, Ovid's shudder. So it's reminding us of Ovid's, and I've agonized over this. Vos mos non sit sponsor. That is nonsense. That is not, that makes no, I can't make it mean anything. Vos means you, could be nominative, could be accusative. Mos, as in mos maiorum, means custom, and would have to be, but non sit sponsor would not be a bride. That's okay. Once we might have found it funny, you will not be a bride, you will be a tree. Now that is essentially a translation of at quoniam coniux mea non potis esse arboris eris certe, which is the other bit. Since you cannot be my wife, you will certainly be my tree. So that bit really is a translation, pretty much a translation of that line of the Daphne story. But vos mos non sit sponsor isn't. The only thing I can think of is that it's a really bad retranslation of, so you start with Ovid's Latin, you take it into English, and then you retranslate it, and it's a really bad one. really bad retranslation. They're not very good. I mean, they did keep bunking off, so it's not surprising they're not very good schoolgirls. But it's clearly meant to be a very explicit, I think, reference to Daphne. And then we have the Metamorphoses. At each ring where her flesh became bark, a path opened, roots split. And we've got this sort of, I mean, the root splitting actually reminds me more of the Metamorphosis, not so much of Daphne as of Mirror, who gets turned into a myrrh tree later in the Metamorphoses, which is a really painful description of metamorphosis. And that has got the roots sort of splitting out through her toes and the twigs splitting out through her hands. It's much more painful. It's a very painful story altogether. Root split. Some believe that anger can take the place of love. She found the verb for it. Of course, that's reminding you of rapere again. But also, it's another thing about, you know, how look for the verb. That's how we teach Latin. Where's the verb? Find the verb. You know, you've got to do that. Having to do with the forest, or a young girl running fast, calling out, then silence. So that's obviously, again, repeating the Dido, not Dido, what's she come in here for? The Daphne story. And then this very strange thing at the end, those wings hidden in the tree, meaning she was not ready to be cut down, not ready to be chopped into little sticks, those twigs that were falling from the text, and tossed into fires assumed supremacy, all that smoke, her ashes refusing to fly. I'm not sure what I think is going on at the end there, but it's something about a, you know, a kind of almost a last refusal of the tree to turn into firewood and be burnt up. Just, I suppose, as the tree, the lignum, the wood in Ovid's version, refused Apollo's kisses. So I think, you know, this poem is a brilliant sign of what Ovid's poetry can be in a creative reimagining in the modern world, and you know, and it's quite good as well for, you know, Ovid as good to think with, and that's a lot of what I you know, try to do with students, is to say that these things, you know, we don't have to say that Ovid is, you know, or the speaker in this is someone that we would admire. That's not the point, you know, or that we would, you know, want to date or something, but that it's very good to think with. Anyway, there I shall stop on a nice tidy hour.
Oh, thank you very much, Alison. And I have. So as long as Alison's happy to field questions, I invite questions.
Absolutely.
Nigel.
A couple of things I would like your opinion on. And one is, when I was a student, and this was in the 1950s, Ovid was not mentioned, except as a supreme versifier. We all tried to write like Ovid when we were doing Latin verses. But until Patrick Wilkinson's book in the mid-50s,
yes, very fine book. Yeah.
I never read a word of Ovid when I was a classic student. Now, what does this say? It actually says to me that a lot of interest in literature is a matter of fashion.
Oh, yeah.
And fashion, and there's no particular reason why Ovid. Anyway, what do you think?
No, I think this is a matter of fashion. And, you know, one of the things is, I mean, you probably read Virgil and Horace. Is that right?
Oh, I didn't.
Yeah. I mean, those were the ones that were very, very popular. I mean, you know, there's a political element to it as well, you know, the changes in sort of, you know, political views, probably.
Really? What do you mean?
Element of that.
What political views are you referring to?
Well, I would say that Ovid speaks to a post-1960s world by being sort of more subversive and so on. I mean, actually, I actually think there's plenty that's subversive in Virgil, but that's a different way of reading Virgil. But fashion, yes, fashion, and I'll tell you another form of fashion is what hasn't been done recently. An awful lot of an awful lot of PhD students at the moment, and in the last 10 years, are doing what I would, in my, but you don't say this, oh, I put enough, is what I would call silver Latin, you know? Loads of Flavian epic and Statius, and I mean, and worse than Statius, I mean, you know,
Valerius Flaccus.
Valerius Flaccus.
Silius.
Yeah, Silius Italicus. Yes. All this is terribly popular, and they try to be terribly enthusiastic about it. I mean, you know, I've supervised lots of things on this, and that's because in my generation, everyone did Ovid. You know, it was the Itas Ovidiana again in the 80s and 90s. Having, you know, previously probably, you know, Virgil, well, nobody touched Virgil, is a bit still true that nobody touches Virgil. Nobody touches Horace. Horace is horrendously hard to teach in universities nowadays. I mean, it just doesn't come over well at all.
Really?
I mean, our colleague Bruce Mallow taught a course in Horace last year, you know, well, she enjoyed it greatly, but she wasn't sure whether the students did, really. I mean, because the thing is, most of them are reading in translation. And I don't think Horace works terribly well in translation. I think that's part of the problem.
And as well as that, in Latin, it's damn hard.
And it's very hard, though we do use it. I mean, Advanced 2 read Horace with one of those lovely old Macmillan school texts, and really makes it much easier. But yes, this is right. I mean, so I think there is an element. I think there's an element of that. Yeah, that it's just tradition. You know, Ovid's come in and out of fashion.
He's been in fashion now for many decades.
He's very, yes, he's still very in fashion. But even then, you know, in the last 10 years, not all that many people have done PhDs on Ovid.
Is that right?
Not like it was in the previous 20 years, where practically, when I was doing my PhD in the 80s in Cambridge, practically everyone was doing Ovid, and for a little while afterwards as well. Yeah, but Ovid does speak well to the modern world, to the sort of, you know, postmodern ways of reading. I think they're very sort of self-conscious, playful, and
do students really tune in to the postmodern way of thinking about literature?
At postgraduate level, they do.
Oh, well,
Yeah. At undergraduate level, obviously it's much more superficial, but they love Ovid. I mean, Ovid goes down very well with the students, mostly. Particularly Metamorphoses, mostly it goes down very well with them. The Fasti is a bit of a difficult one.
Oh, the Tristia is really.
Oh yeah, but I mean, I mean, Ruth manages to engage the students with the Tristia really well by a course on the poetry of exile, or the literature of exile, and does that quite effectively. But
could I develop that point, if I may, Alison, and sort of usurp my position in chairing it? We talk about fashion, and I entirely agree with you. Things do come in waves in fashion. The interesting thing for me, of course, is that, say, the medieval period, which I've got a bit of an interest. Ovid is very much in fashion.
Yes,
I mean, my question would be, when did he fall from grace? And why do you think he fell from grace? So, you know, he's a very, arguably, I would say, you know, the 14th century, he is the classical poet that most people are absorbed.
Well, that's the first Itas Ovidiana. And with the and actually he's massive for Shakespeare. Massive for Shakespeare.
You've got to wait till the 19th century.
19th, perhaps late 18th, 19th century. Yeah. He falls through the floor.
I mean, is it just you know, some people would say, wouldn't they, the Victorian age is an age of prudery, and various things are pushed to the side that have been central for a long time. I mean, is that the key to it, or?
Victoria is just like
no. It's an interesting phenomenon. I'm just trying to explore, you know, where it.
But I always think the internet explanation for this is just fashion, like length of skirts. I mean, there's an explanation for having short or long skirts.
Well,
Oh, but you think there are?
yeah, I think there is. I think that short skirts has got to do, it would be a little bit odd if it had nothing to do
Shorter
with
or longer skirts. I'm not talking about
the move from long skirts to shorter skirts in the early part of the 20th century.
I'm talking about mini skirts. I'm talking about, up or down 2 inches.
Okay, that
Yeah.
I will agree is just
Yeah.
fashion. Yes, yeah.
Can I just say, I did a tiny bit of research this afternoon just because I've only just learned what it is, so I did a full read. And this question that you were just saying about when did it fall out of fashion, and this is only Wikipedia, but what it said was the Puritans, and that he was perceived as pagan, so they put it to the 17th century.
I mean, I don't know. I'd be surprised because he was pagan all the way through.
Yeah, but pagan, this is something I really struggle with because I'm trying to get a handle on why in the Renaissance, when the Counter-Reformation is going on, people are so obsessively anxious about heresy, but they're not the least bit bothered about the pagan.
It's because of the special status of the classical
Yes,
world.
yes.
Because I mean, in a way, that was. I mean, Virgil's pagan too. So yeah. So I don't think pagan of itself can be.
Yeah.
I mean, can be an issue. I mean, I think prudery could be much more. Though, but I think I'm afraid Wikipedia is at fault there because I actually think it's a bit later than that. Because people like Johnson and that kind of thing, they're still they're very Ovidian, and I mean, I think it's really 18th second half of 18th century before before Ovid is kind of falling out of fashion, and I would think, but I mean, the attitude to paganness. I mean, obviously there's a great tradition in the Middle Ages of Christianizing Virgil, but if you go right back to Augustine, for Augustine, sort of the sorrows of Dido are epitomize pagan literature for him as something that is, enormously attractive, but ultimately something that he has to turn away from. He, describes himself as weeping over the fate of Dido, and which I always like the fact that it's the sufferings of Dido that epitomize classical literature for him, not the greatness of Aeneas or anything.
I think it says something about the late empire and the high empire personally, but that's perhaps for a row down the pub one day.
Yeah, well, I think it could be that as well, of course. Yes, it could be that. But to Augustine, pagan literature is still a challenge and a problem, whereas it isn't really by the time you get to the late Middle Ages.
No, I think it is in the early Middle Ages.
It's too positive. It's too, classical is basically good. I mean, because it enables you to speak Latin, I suppose, is the part of the reason. I mean, Ovid is also useful. I mean, yes, a great versifier, a little bit easier perhaps to translate than Horace, and that could be a reason. I don't know whether that's quite as true as people certainly used to say. And people said all sorts of nonsense about Ovid, of course, like the fact that his versification is so trips along so easily in order to deceive you, and you don't realise the emptiness of the content.
That's what people say.
Well, it's somebody from about the 1920s said that. Yeah.
Oh, some idiot or other.
Yeah. But generally, yes, brilliant versifier, absolutely.
Do we have any information about why he chose this topic in the Metamorphoses? Why did he choose to write
Why did he choose to write? Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. I think that it is because, right, to be a poet, if you kind of live that long, you certainly in the Augustan world, it's fairly clear that you kind of move up through the genres. So you've got Virgil, who does the eclogues, which are sort of small-scale pastoral poetry. He then moves up into the Georgics, which is a bigger, more serious didactic poetry about farming. And then he moves up to the Aeneid, and he writes his great epic. And that is the goal of everybody, is to write the great epic. The elegists, Propertius, Tibullus, they're writing their elegy, and at the same time they're often saying, oh, I will write epic eventually when I have finished writing elegy, but I'm too little and light, I can't write elegy, I can't write epic, it's too big, it's too great, I'm just this like little poet writing my little stuff. But eventually, and Propertius says this, I write an epic when my girl has been written, as what Propertius says. Okay, Propertius died, or at least he goes silent in about 16 BC. Tibullus also. Horace moves up to the odes, and eventually the Carmen Saeculare, the really big public work. So you move up through the genres. It's what you're expected to do. So there's Ovid. He's written the Amores. He's moved up to the Ars Amatoria, which is still in elegiacs, which is the meter of amatory poetry, but it is taking many of the shapes of didactic. So it's clearly, I mean, this very obviously modelled on Virgil's move from the eclogues to the Georgics, is Ovid's move from the Amores to the Ars Amatoria. I mean, you know, that's really clear that that's what's happening. So what's he got to do next? What he's got to do next is an epic. But if you think, okay, Virgil died 19 BC, Aeneid unfinished in some sense, and published by his executors and so on. And there's all that story about how he threatened, how he wanted to have it burnt, but the executors didn't allow it to be burnt because Augustus said that would be terrible, and off it goes. Okay, and so there it is, and he is just like a legend. He is the god of poetry. And so everybody wants to be Virgil. And Ovid interestingly says, he talks about all these other poets. Virgil I only saw, he says, you know, which, what does he mean by that? Is it a biographical statement, or is it a statement of something about the greatness of Virgil? So he's got to move into writing an epic. But what you do after Virgil has done the Aeneid, which is it's already so dominant. We're talking about 20 years later, the Ars Amatoria is published sometime between 2 BC and 82, in those 3 years in that period. So it's after that, so we're in the first decade AD now. Virgil's been dead for 20, 30 years, 20, 25 years, something like that, is absolutely the dominant poet. Horace is dead, Ovid is like, you know, the elegists are all dead. Ovid is the poet now, and so what he needs to do is write an epic, but he can't just copy Virgil. He can't just do another thing like Virgil. So he's got to find a way of writing an epic that is fundamentally different while still being clearly an epic. And he chooses this idea of Metamorphoses, the idea of stringing together a work that is made up of lots of little works. Now, for that, he has a justification in the Aitia of Callimachus. Now, Callimachus, who is a 3rd century BC Greek poet, is very much used by the Augustan poets as an inspiration, a master who tells them how to be poets. And they all kind of say, oh, you know, Propertius tries to say he's Rome's Callimachus, and Horace says he is, and even Virgil kind of in the eclogues does things that show that he's being Rome's Callimachus. Everyone wants to be Rome's Callimachus. And Callimachus wrote his Aitia, which is a story of origins, like etiologies, and it's lots of kind of different stories shoved together to make one big poem. And so Ovid's kind of imitating that as well. And so he's got this poem that it is an epic, and it does ultimately work towards the last thing in the Metamorphoses. It goes from the origins of time, from the beginning of time, from the origin of the world, ab origine mundi, from the origin of the world up to his own times. And so it's got this huge chronological spread. And the very end of the poem, well, almost the very end of the poem, is the metamorphosis, the apotheosis, the becoming a god of Augustus, who, of course, is not dead yet. This is done as a prophecy of the apotheosis of Augustus. And then that's the end of the poem. Oh, except there isn't. There's a little bit after the end. And what happens then is that Ovid predicts his own apotheosis, his own metamorphosis into his poetry, which he does with a very explicit reference to Odes 330 to Horace. It's very complicated the way they're all working together, but this is why. It's how do you write epic after Virgil has done what he has done? And the answer is to create this kind of multiple, strange epic, but that I maintain is actually nonetheless an epic. That's another one of those standard questions, you know, is Ovid's Metamorphoses an epic poem or not? The answer is yes, by the way. But yes, but in the most non-epic way you could be, but still be an epic. You see, it's quite interesting to look at what happens to epic afterwards, because the next thing that happens to epic is Lucan. And Lucan, in the time of Nero, writes an epic. He tries to do Virgil, while not being Virgil, by writing an epic without gods, except that it has got gods really, but it pretends not to have gods. And it's an epic that is of recent history. It's the Pompey Caesar Civil War. So how long ago is that? It's about 100 years, isn't it? Yeah. The maths is too hard when you've got to go over naught. And then the Flavians come along and do epic try to redo Virgil in another way. And Statius does his Divide and so on. So they didn't learn from Ovid. I don't think any of them did it. Well, they did kind of learn something, but they boringly just go back to imitating Virgil in a way. But I think that's why he chose the particular stories he chooses. Who knows? They make good stories. I mean, sometimes, you know, he has to fiddle about to get the Metamorphoses in. You know, some of but you know, but it doesn't stop him if there isn't. You know, it isn't just that he has to. If he wants to have a story in there, he'll find a way of getting the Metamorphoses in. He'll tack something on the end or something.
I can see why students like him, though, because they're like horror stories.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just make you squirm.
Yeah, no, they do. Yeah, no, they're also at the level of the individual story. They're very easy to get a handle on. At the level of the whole poem, they're extremely difficult to keep track of where you are. But at the individual story, I mean, many of the stories that you know from myths of the Greeks and Romans, you know, Daedalus and Icarus, Narcissus looking and looking in the pool and falling in love with his own reflection, they're all in there. In fact, that's where they come from. That's why we know them.
Which is why the fall from grace is such a striking thing in a way.
Yeah.
Sorry, someone else. Well, I thought you were pointing at someone there, magisterially. No,
I wasn't. I don't think so. I was just
having a drink.
yeah.
Can I ask a question? Chair?
Yeah, well, Alison, I know, has to go back to the wilds of Manchester, but I think we've got time for one more question,
One
if
more
she's happy
question,
with that.
and it's something you haven't mentioned at all
Mm.
in your, if I may say, most engaging talk. Thanks for your comment. And it's the poem that you wrote on women's complaints about being abandoned. The Hercules.
The Hercules, yes.
Now, what I haven't read any of the Hercules for decades,
Right.
so I don't know. I mean,